I think awareness is everything. We can't change what we're not aware of. People that are in business use data and analysis, and they have numbers and they look at it and you can see what's working and what's not working. Well, if we don't have a tendency to be able to do that for ourselves, then we're kind of walking around blind. So I always say that everybody knows your blind spots. Wouldn't you want to know them as well?
Welcome to the Power of Respect podcast with Charlie Leichtweis, author of the book, The Power of Respect in Business. Charlie is one of America's foremost authorities on respect and leadership development. And now, here's Charlie.
Hello, I'm Charlie Leichtweis. Welcome to another episode of the Power of Respect podcast. As I think about all the things and lessons I've learned throughout my career, one of the most important is how to be able to respect others, even when we might disagree or dislike their point of view. We see this challenge virtually everywhere we look today in all aspects of our society. The task to conquer this challenge is not about achieving perfection in our interactions with others. It's not about everyone agreeing all the time. It's about building relationships through trying to first respect others. This is why I created the Power of Respect podcast and why it's so important to me to bring the leadership of respect to you through the life experiences of others. I hope today and in each of these episodes you find some example of the experiences of others that will help you with your challenge of leadership in your lives. Today we are talking about the role awareness plays in our ability to be successful leaders. So I'm excited today to have a guest who has deep experience in the psychology of leadership and executive coaching. She is a speaker, executive coach, and mentor, and author of the book, Mastery Under Pressure. In her book, she gives leaders the tools to empower themselves and their team. So please welcome Tina Greenbaum. Tina, so good to be with you.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks for having me.
So as we think about your extensive leadership in organizations in terms of helping leaders, what are some of the biggest challenges maybe that you see face leaders today?
Well, today is even greater than, I would say it's more public. I don't know that it's so much even greater. But the greatest challenge is staying calm, cool, and collected in just a world that is kind of going a little bit crazy. There is nothing that was before is no more, and people are having to reinvent themselves, reinvent their companies. And a great leader is somebody that everybody kind of wants to kind of hang around them, that they have a certain level of presence and calmness inside. And that's not an easy thing to accomplish.
And so when you're talking and advising people, if you could share some examples, confidentially, of course, with some examples of what you've uncovered and how you've helped those folks?
Well, having been a trusted advisor for a long time, I get to hear things that most people don't talk about. A lot of pressures. So we have workaholism, we have alcoholism, sometimes even some drug abuse, sometimes marital affairs, sometimes kids really hating their parents. These are the things that people don't talk about. Depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, you name it, people have it. And so having to overcome a lot of these things and find different ways and different tools and are some of the great successes, honestly, that I've had in my career.
Mm-hmm. I know you talk a lot about awareness, personal awareness. How does that play into this?
Well, I think awareness is everything. We can't change what we're not aware of. People that are in business use data and analysis, and they have numbers and they look at it and you can see what's working and what's not working. Well, if we don't have a tendency to be able to do that for ourselves, then we're kind of walking around blind. So I always say that everybody knows your blind spots. Wouldn't you want to know them as well? So the level of awareness, the word mindfulness has become sort of a thing that, people just talk about all the time, but it's an ancient practice. And the definition that I use is mindfulness is being aware in the present moment without judgment. So it's the without judgment that is challenging for most of us humans. But that's how we learn and grow.
No, that's so true. And the concept of judgment is also one frequently misunderstood. Some people are made to feel guilty about their judgments as opposed to understand them. And in my experience, to not take them from being judgment to being judgmental. So
Exactly.
could you comment on that a little bit from what you've seen?
Well, when we when we get into judging ourselves and judging other people, we get into right, wrong, and good and bad. And when we're there, we again can't do anything with it. So again, if we come back to it, kind of the metaphor of looking at analytics, at looking at numbers, they just be, they just are, and then we bring our interpretation to it. So if we can be non-judgmental about things that we're judgmental about. You and I talked about bias the other day, and this is a perfect example of where judgments come in. You know, we're products of our environment, all kinds of aspects of our environment. And so if we're not aware of our biases, if we're not aware of our value systems, then they operate unconsciously without us really being in charge.
Mm-hmm. No, that's very difficult as human beings, of course. So maybe you could share more about when awareness exists, or when people can improve their awareness, how that helps them be more effective going forward versus their lack of awareness turning into judgmental situations, which actually disprove their ability to lead.
Okay, so when we're not aware, the unconscious drives us as opposed to us driving it. So if you were to imagine, and again, we're an auditory, but if you were imagine that you're holding a piece of paper, and above the paper is a magnet or magnetic filings, and below the paper is the magnet. So the magnet actually drives the magnetic filings. It drives the behavior, right?
Right.
So if you're not aware that this is happening, then it's chaotic. That we're on automatic. We're just on this pilot. We just react. And obviously, actually, this is the whole essence of my whole career, is how do we get under the conscious mind, because the body gets triggered before the mind.
Right.
And if we don't have that level of awareness of what's happening internally, then we just are reactive people all over the place.
You know, that's how what you do and say relates directly to the concept of what's in my book on the power of respect, the concept of understanding that we're all on a psychological scale of some kind or another all the time, and to begin to help ourselves understand where we are on that scale, and more importantly, what moves us up and down that scale. So for me, if I'm listening to somebody and I say to myself, I really don't like what they're saying or where they're going, if I can stop that process and think, how can I respect that person? It causes me to pause, not to go to the frustration or anger with what they're saying. And therefore I can maintain more effectiveness as a leader and actually help them, which was my intention to begin with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, Charlie, somebody, a very wise person said to me one time that the reason that people, countries, everybody fight is because they misunderstand each other. And so the goal is, again, just kind of what you say, with respect. Let me hear what you have to say. You know, I may not agree with it, but if I can't hear you, then I'm talking over you. And then I'm on my own bandwidth again, you know,
right.
Not communicating.
And it takes a certain amount of practice, clearly, to overcome that. I mean, practice is anything we do in life, whether it's a sport, whether it's a musical thing, or whatever it may be that we want to be good at. In order to be the best we can be, there's one thing that we have to do in any of those cases, and that's practice.
You are not kidding.
So how do you advise people on how to practice?
So this is a very opportune question at the moment, because I'm just getting ready to give a TEDx talk next week, actually this coming Saturday. And it's all about practice and repetition and using all the skills that I teach, which are, I call it mastery under pressure. And so it's focus, relaxation, how to deal with negative self-talk, how to visualize, and dealing with fear. So these are the 5 skills and strategies that once we learn how to use these skills, whether it's working with ourselves or working with other people. So for me, in terms of learning this talk that I'm giving, how to focus, when to be in focus, to recognize when I'm out of focus, and then how to bring myself back in again so that I can concentrate on what I'm doing. Relaxation, being able to relax the body so that the mind can be very clear. What happens when we get anxious is when we get beyond our nervous system's capacity to tolerate stress, there's a whole physiological thing that happens. It's the stress response. And then basically we can't think clearly. The mind goes off. It goes offline. Mm-hmm. And that's when we get into trouble. And that's where that, again, that level of awareness of knowing yourself well enough, knowing when you're beginning to start to get agitated so that you have these skills to kind of bring you back into a state of relaxation or changing your nervous system again. So it's focus, relaxation, dealing with negative self-talk. One of the things that I found myself when I was learning this is, what happens if I forget where I'm at? So just even that question then begins to start to put doubt. And then it doesn't take me to a useful place other than coming up with a solution. What would happen if I lose my place? Mm-hmm. I have to have a solution for that. Mm-hmm. And the solution is knowing it so well so that I can trust that my unconscious will give me the next piece of information if I just take a pause.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Strategy. Mm-hmm. And then visualization, visualizing this experience, the energy that I want to create. Again, when you're presenting to other people and you want to make a good impression, whether it's it's just a one-on-one or whether you have a big presentation to give, I do a lot of time ahead of time imagining how I want to be, imagining the room, imagining the people, imagining the energy and the atmosphere that I want to create through my own abilities. Mm-hmm. And then fear. Yeah, it's a pretty scary thing. This is a live event.
Oh, yes.
Right? So how do I manage the fear? I use my fear as my best friend. What am I afraid of? What am I most afraid of? And I start to analyze that. Well, if that happens, then I can do this. If that happens, then I can do that. And so in essence, what we're really doing is putting ourselves back in charge. One of the questions people ask me all the time, if you have one thing to ask me, to tell me that would help me, it's what's in my control, what's out of my control.
That makes sense. And it strikes me that all these things have a great bearing on the whole communication process. And when you think about, or at least when I think about, I should say, trying to talk to a bunch of people or explain something, what if I lose my place? And what if there's silence? And we think silence is the death of the situation. And actually, there's nothing absolutely wrong with silence.
Absolutely not. It's the pause. We like to call it the pause.
Fair enough.
Right? Because when we pause, just as I'm doing now, okay, it gives everybody an opportunity to kind of come back to you and with you and kind of think about what you're saying. If you go too fast, then people aren't going to be able to catch what you're saying. So it's being able to pace yourself. And, if you have to take a pause, you take a pause.
Absolutely. And gathering your own thoughts is not an issue. It happens to all of us. And in fact, we quite frankly want it to happen from time to time to make sure we're really going where we want to go.
So let me just add something to that, because I think, again, one of the skills that I've learned that it's really helpful when I recognize that I'm anxious, okay, and I'm kind of losing my concentration, I come back again to the body. come back and take a nice deep breath and reconnect my head and my heart.
Okay. Yeah.
Because it's my heart that I'm speaking to you from. If we're a talking head, there's no emotion. And then we get bored.
You're just droning on at that point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, this is great insight, and I hope that our listeners are finding some piece of it that relates to how they feel as they're going through things. The other side of this communication process we've been talking about strikes me is the listening side, and how important that is. Why don't you share your thoughts on listening?
So I like to call myself actually a professional listener because, again, it's a skill. And people who like to talk sometimes like to talk over people, or it's very, very common for when we're in a situation like I don't want to lose that thought, so I'm going to hold on to it, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to say, but I've already lost the conversation because now you're in someplace else. So what I think about being a really good listener is being on the same wavelength, staying on the same wavelength with the person that you're speaking with. And that takes concentration. It takes focus. And so I have a rule for myself, particularly when I'm working. And I try to do it all the time, actually, but mostly I'm very, very mindful about it when I'm working. That if I get distracted and I lose what you're saying, rather than pretending that I heard it, I'm going to come back and I'm going to say, Charlie, could you repeat that, please? I missed that. And so I think of it, again, your listeners can't see us, but we're always on the same wavelength. And it's my job as a listener to do that. Because you may not have that level of awareness. That may not be something that you're practiced at. So it's my job to make sure that I understand exactly what you're saying. And if everybody were to learn the skills that we learn as coaches and counselors of how to ask questions, how to stay on track with somebody, this is what I think I heard you say. Could you repeat it, please? I want to make sure that we're understanding each other. And just that staying, it's sort of, it's like a game, you're working with each other. It's not a one shot thing that I'm on my own, my own path, which is what happens so much. And if you start paying attention to how you feel when you're listening to somebody, whether you feel heard or not, it begins to start to give you kind of a really good sense about how good of a listener am I.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. And again, practicing that as much as possible would really help make any of us better at it over time.
And I have a couple other little suggestions that comes from assertiveness training. So if you don't ask for what you want, you get a 0% of an opportunity to get what you want. If you ask for what you want, you get a 50%, because you're not always going to get what you want. Number one. Number two is the way that you ask for what you want, or the way that you speak, has everything to do whether somebody is possibly going to give you what you want. So in other words, there are certain styles of communication. And this one, people who are under a lot of pressure frequently are guilty of this. It's about you. You didn't do this. You didn't do that. You can't, again, see me. I'm pointing my finger. But as soon as there's a finger pointing, it feels like an attack. The easiest thing for us to do is to blame other people. When we talk about how arguments start, and if you could listen really carefully and listen to an argument, there's always a you in there. It's your fault. And so again, the response to that is, no, it's not me, it's you. Right? So then we get into blaming each other. And then we don't get anywhere. So that's number one. Number two, another style is to be very passive. I'm just not speaking up. I'm not doing anything. I'm just kind of listening. And when somebody's passive on the other end, it's like, I don't want to do anything for you. You're not taking responsibility. And then there's passive aggressive, where I know that you're mad at me, but I'm not saying it. So my eyes are rolling around in my head, or I got a big sigh going on. And all those kinds of communication bring up other feelings in people that put them off to you. So if you want to ask for what you want, it's always from an I feel perspective, or I want to give feedback to somebody. This is what's going on for me when I hear you doing this, or when I see you doing this. Because nobody can argue with your feelings.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And we're not always aware of that dynamic going on in our conversation.
Yes.
I think we talked about another example, even if you're not pointing the finger and saying you, another example we talked about, it was actually one of my experiences. If somebody's telling me about an issue, in my mind, I quickly am down the road thinking, I know where they're going. I've got this solved, and I'm thinking about all this stuff, and they're looking at me like, dude, you're not listening to me. And I think I am, and I don't mean not to be, but I'm not listening to them. And a good friend of mine gave me the advice, and it was so valuable, mostly because it was 2 words, which I can remember more than anything else. He said, when you're listening to somebody, listen longer, because when you do that, not only will they understand you're listening to them, you may find that they may not be going where you thought, number one. And even if they are, you'll still be engaging them in terms of helping them solve a problem. And I combine that with a thought process I had to try to marry with, if you're right now, you'll be right later. So you ought to be able to wait. Not easy, but you always say, I should be able to wait, because my point will still be valid if it really is later on.
Right. So that goes back, Charlie, again, to being in this, in the same wavelength.
Yeah.
So one of the things, again, that we talked about is when you've been in a position of leadership for a long time and you understand a certain process, you do get there more quickly than most other people. Great leaders see things way, way, way down the road. And one of the problems that they have is the level of impatience.
Yes.
That other people don't see it as quickly as they do. And so I like to tell people, and that's why you're in the position that you're in. Because you have those abilities.
Okay.
And at the same time, appreciating that not everybody thinks like you do. And
well, it also connects with your concept of fear. If I'm afraid that I'm going to forget down the road, or if I'm afraid that, I will appear that I don't know, or, those kinds of things, it could trigger me to not be patient that I need to be.
That's right. So you can also make a mental note, and you can also say to somebody, I have a point that I want to bring up, but I don't want to railroad this, derail this conversation right now. So just kind of remind me later or something.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Or I want to write down a little note. You brought something up for me, and I want to just jot it down.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And we'll come back to it.
That's all. Those are all helpful things that any of us can do if we just try to start them out and practice. And it's not about perfection, because we're never going to get there. So if we can do any of these things, even 5% more than we have, just think how much better things.
One of my favorite yoga things about that is practice makes progress.
There you go. That's a more human result as opposed to perfection. So when it comes to future leaders, I mean, you coach existing leaders. If you were in front of a group or any individual that sought advice that was coming up the ranks, so to speak, what would be some of the key takeaways or advice you would give them? I know you've kind of talked about it in the discussion today, which I think is great. But is there like 1 or 2, 3 things or something you might say to them to keep in mind?
One thing would be to be humble and
Yes.
to really appreciate where you are in the level of your development and evolution. I think one of the problems that a lot of people are talking about, in the millennial generation is, they get into a job and they want to be the senior manager, in a year. And to appreciate that senior manager, that, again, through practice and growth and experiences, there are things that are sometimes so intangible, but if we work at it, we do get wiser as we get older, and we do have greater experiences. So and the other thing is, I would find the winners, find the people that you really admire, and get to know them. I always ask, even with my kids when they were kind of at the younger ages, find people that you want to follow, and learn about them. How did they get to where they are? What was their path? What were some of the challenges that they had? So it really is, and it goes back to your topic, Charlie. It's having respect for experience and wisdom. And
No, I personally believe that very much so. So I'm glad you pointed that out as well. And it's about the relationship building. And
yes,
if you build relationships with the winners, as you call them, and that's a subjective thing, but you find the right people and build the relationship with them, you'll learn faster, and you'll find out more about how you can be more effective within your own abilities and idiosyncrasies, if you will. And I think that's important because people talk a lot today about trust, and it's extremely important. But to me, trust is the T in respect, and it's part of it. But respect builds trust, and trust builds relationships, and that is, from my perspective, one of the keys to leadership. Results are important, no doubt about it. I think leadership's an equal emphasis on results and relationships, but relationships are the part we often leave by the wayside because it's A, more difficult, and B, we can't calculate it on a spreadsheet so easily.
without a doubt. But yes, the other thing is that that's getting a lot more attention today, which I think is really important, is going with your strengths, being, again, humble with yourself and knowing yourself well enough to know, where do you really shine? I have a good friend who says, if it's not your genius, it's not your job. You can't always have the luxury, at the earlier stages of having and at any stage really, but really kind of being okay with what you can't do. I have a client of mine that I hadn't talked to in a really long time, and I've known him for about maybe 18, 20 years. And he was early on in his career, sort of mid-level, I think, when we met. And he loved leadership, he loved psychology, and he was in a financial institution, and never great with the details, and always kind of struggling to get to the next level, and wasn't getting appreciated. And so I talked to him just not so very long ago, and his company has instituted something like the Strength Finders, where it's I think there's like 32 or 35 or 37 strengths that we have, and if we're operating on our top 5, we're really, really zooming and being able to move forward. And his managers were always trying to put him in a box and he was trying to put himself in that same box of, now that he can look at his strengths, they were way down low, like really low. And so as his company has become more forward thinking, and as he's kind of pushed for the stuff that he's really good at, and he's a senior VP now, and just heading all kinds of wonderful leadership conferences. And so again, it's that level of awareness. Everything comes back to between you and you first. This is my opinion. And this is the advice that I give to people, is is really what's between your ears, what's going on between you, and behavior comes in patterns. There's a lot of times people don't want to do personal growth. Oh, there's so much that's going on. There's so much. There's not that much. They're the same patterns that show up frequently from childhood over and over and over and over again. And as we can nail those and work on those, everything else sort of falls into place.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And as I think about it, we have to turn disappointment or learning from inactual words to actual words. When somebody says, "Oh, that was terrible," or "I did terrible," I understand why they're frustrated, but terrible is not an actual word. It doesn't tell you what should you do next or what should you think about next. And so anytime we can be frustrated, it's human nature. We can maybe be angry about something. The next step is, how do I turn that into something that is actionable? Or how do I have somebody help me turn it into something that's actionable?
But you bring up another really, really, really important point in terms of managers and leadership. Good managers are good coaches.
Mm-hmm.
They understand human nature. And if they don't, then there's so many things to learn. It may not be the most natural thing for somebody. But all the things that we're talking about are teachable and learnable. And good coaches learn these skills. They may have a natural ability, kind of in terms of emotional intelligence, it may be higher on their scale. But if you're in a position of managership and leadership, you have a responsibility to learn these things, because the most important thing that people want is to be heard.
I think that can resonate with every one of our listeners for sure. And this conversation has been terrific. We could go on forever. And in fact, I hope to have you on another episode in the future. This has been terrific, Tina, and I really appreciate your time and your insights. So again, if anybody wants to look her up, Tina Greenbaum, she's on LinkedIn. Look up her book, The Mastery Under Pressure. There's some tips in there as well, of course. But this is exactly the kind of thing that I think is important for any of us who've learned the hard way or over time how to let people who are on the path know what we've learned as we go forward. So thank you again so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
I want to thank Tina Greenbaum for being with us today, and I especially want to thank you for listening to this episode of the Power of Respect podcast. If you like what you heard today, please consider sharing the podcast and visit our website, expertsinhow.com. A quick reminder, if you'd like to read my book, The Power of Respect in Business, it's available on Amazon. Thanks again for listening, and remember, respect builds trust, trust builds relationships, and relationships are the key to leadership. Thank you.
This has been the Power of Respect podcast with Charlie Leichtweis, author of the book, The Power of Respect in Business. To listen to more episodes and to learn about Charlie's leadership development programs, visit his website, expertsinhow.com.